what's a kink, and what are the most common kinks you see in your practice?
So a kink is basically anything that is different than the norm. So like the normative missionary or basic few positions of sex. So we can think about a kink as like something that focuses on arousal around a body part. I mean, that might be a fetish too.
Yeah.
It can be a construct or a fantasy, a role play. It can be a scenario. It can be appreciating different kinds of sensations, sometimes even pain, which a lot of people are like, whoa, how can that be hot? But if you think about the way that pain operates in the body, it creates an intensity of sensation, and it also releases a lot of endorphins that can feel really amazing and sometimes even state altering for folks.
And pain actually maps the same areas of the body.
Yeah.
So it's actually interesting. I was just talking to Barry Komisarek, who had a podcast on episode on this podcast, and he talked about his researchers on, orgasm and the brain, and how he's like, it's unclear to us still, like what makes a stimulation pain versus pleasure when they both map to the same areas of the brain. So there's a lot of sort of overlap there.
That's really interesting. Well, both of them are nervous system upregulating, right? So it makes a lot of sense that they would be indistinguishable in that part of the brain. Some of the most common kinks that I hear about and work with folks around are things like a foot fetish, not surprisingly, but for a lot of people, it seems so not sexy. But feet can be really sexy for so many reasons. And one hypothesis that's out there is actually because the genitals and the feet in the somatosensory areas of the brain are right next to each other. So there's sometimes a lot of, stimulation that happens in both places. So foot fetishes are probably the most common. Different kinds of role play, like anything around BDSM, it's far more common than I think people want to admit. Because look, we want to play with topics that feel maybe difficult or challenging or exciting or inaccessible in some way in our real lives. So things like power and authority and sensation exchange and just, really playing around with things with ideas, concepts, and emotions that we may not have other avenues to. Like you said, sex is play. So for a lot of folks, changing up their power dynamics is a way to play with feeling humiliated in a safe context, or feeling vulnerable in a safe context, or feeling responsible for someone in a way that is time limited and allows us to feel like we can step into that safely.
That's so interesting. Do you think that there's a certain kind of person that gravitates towards those sort of role playing, like power and vulnerable, being more vulnerable or being shamed versus being the dominant, so to speak, or the powerful one?
I think a lot of what we seek in our sex lives, especially if we're into kinky contexts or fetishes, can represent parts of ourselves that we don't get to experience in our day-to-day lives. So, for example, I've worked with countless high-powered male C-level folks, lots of money, lots of responsibilities, and they love to be humiliated and dominated by women. And it is the only place in their lives where they're not responsible for someone else, and where someone else is telling them what to do and making sure that they have some accountability to that. Right? Because in their lives, everyone around them is a yes person and they take orders from them. So, it's one of the areas where they can feel really held and cared for and nurtured, even though it sounds paradoxical.
Yeah, that's interesting. What about fantasy? So very often there's a lot of shame around sexual fantasy, because you might have a fantasy, for example, people will say I have a fantasy of being raped, right? Which is like very complex in your head, because you're like, I know this is bad. This is not something I would want in real life, but I have this fantasy. Or other sort of fantasies that are sort of on the fringe of what's accepted in terms of society.
Well, I would say our fantasies are not reality, right? By default, they are stories. They are an experience in some beautiful world where nothing is going to happen. So just because you fantasize about something does not mean that you want it in real life, and doesn't mean that if you had that thing happen in real life that you would enjoy it. Our fantasies give us a sense of control. They give us forever agency because we can always just say, nope, no more. That's the line.
Yep.
Right? And so nothing can happen in our fantasies that we are not okay with, which is why fantasies are a great place to explore some of these really complex feelings like forced arousal or consensual non-consent kinks. So not surprisingly to psychologists and sex therapists, but perhaps surprisingly to folks who don't think about or study these things, forced arousal is one of the most popular fantasies for women.
Yeah.
And I think the reason is because in our fantasy, it is safe to feel overpowered by someone's desire, right? And to feel even a little bit scared because it's not happening in real life.
Yeah.
Even if you have that exchange with someone, you're agreeing to the terms, right? You have an out, you're controlling what's going to happen. So it feels like a way to have some autonomy and some power over what in real life can feel really disempowering.
Do you think, I mean, this is one thing that I sort of think about, as you mentioned, that's one of the most common fantasies of women. Very often when they're reading erotic literature, or they want a man who is dominant or who is not asking for permission, so to speak. And so I wonder now, how do you ask for that? If you wanted that from your partner, but now, like, of course, there's all these important discussions around consent where, like, nobody would ever do that because it could be misconstrued as something negative. Is there something missing? Like, how do people or women ask for that if they want that from their partner?
So I think one of the things to remember is that you're not asking for your partner to overpower you or be dominant in an abusive way. What you're asking for is a reprieve. You're asking for an experience. You're asking for an emotional experience. And how you get there might be different, right? But what you're asking your partner for is to be able to surrender into passion without having to make decisions and think about things. So sometimes that can be an easier way to try to understand what you like, what your partner likes, and how to talk about it. Because it can feel really scary, I think, even for a lot of partners to step into that place and be like, I don't want to hurt you.
Yeah.
I don't want to do something that crosses a line because I'm not that person, right?
Right.
And I think those are legitimate conversations to have. So how you set it up with them is to, one, talk about what it is you think is exciting and the why. And then you can both decide in how do you get to the why and what you're really searching for underneath. And then really negotiate together and make an agreement on what's going to happen in that scene, right? Not forever. You're not going to be okay with this forever, potentially. But what do you want to happen in this next sexual exchange that you have? And really be clear with each other on here's what this might look like. Here are my absolute no's, my deal breakers, and develop some safe words and safe gestures so that you can get out of a scenario if it isn't what you thought it would be, or if it starts to become something that no longer feels good or empowering for you. The other thing that's really important is after you play that scene out, to spend a lot of time in aftercare. Because when you engage in those kinds of kinky dynamics, oftentimes for both the doms or the tops and the subs or the bottoms, there can be a trance-like state that occurs. And a lot of endorphins, a lot of adrenaline, a lot of neurochemicals that are flooding your body and feel so good. But when you stop, they come down and you can experience bouts of dysphoria. In fact, there's a term for it called subdrop. So really important to talk ahead of time on like what might feel nurturing. How do you want to take care of yourself, each other? Some people like to journal. Some people like to watch comedies together. Some people, serve their partner soup and give them a warm blanket, right?
Yeah.
There's no right or wrong, but like really build in that aftercare as an intentional part of the process. And then when you're feeling back to yourselves, really debrief what happened and how you feel about it so that you can take those notes together and use it to improve your next experience.
So what about people who participate, they go through the whole process, they debrief, and then later either they don't like the feeling that they were so vulnerable in that situation, or they feel regret? Like, how do they handle that?
Yeah, it can happen for sure. I think one, expect that you might have a lot of mixed feelings, especially if it's a newer experience that you're trying to incorporate. And I would say take some time to be reflective around what is the regret. Do you have regret because you feel like you stepped into a version of yourself that's not allowed, which is often what happens? Or is the regret because one or both of you crossed a boundary that you set with each other? That's a different kind of communication to have with your partner. Does it feel regretful because it wasn't as fun as you thought it might be? Well, that's a different reason to kind of have those feelings come up. So I would say take the time to be inquisitive without judgment, right? Without judgment on you or your partner, unless your partner crossed a boundary.
Yeah.
Right? Then it's super important to have that conversation and be really direct about how you're feeling. But if that didn't happen and you're nervous about what this means about you or whether or not it's sustainable to keep doing it again. I mean, I work with a lot of folks who experience grief and regret because they really, really loved the experience.
Yeah.
And they're terrified that it's not going to be something within their grasp. And that can bring up a lot of grief that then unleashes a sense of regret, like, why did I even open that door?
Huh. Interesting. Do you feel like there's a way, so say you have a partner who really loves a sort of kink or even a type of sexual encounter, and the other partner is like, meh, or they don't really like it. Is there a way to compromise in those situations?
I think there can be. There can be. And it often starts with, again, getting curious about what is it that you take away from this experience that you love so much? Because maybe it's not about the thing that they're asking, but the feeling that they want to feel. So there are other paths to that feeling that you can get on board with or feel excited about.
Yeah.
But it's super important to think, like, can you show up for your partner's pleasure? If, and really hold space for their pleasure, even if it's not your number one fantasy. And I would say there's a lot of merit in saying, like, okay, tonight we're going to do this thing for you that you really love. And it's not my favorite thing, but I know you really appreciate it. And I want to be a part of that with you.
Yeah.
Right? Versus, I'm really against this, or this is really painful. That's a boundary that I think you should respect.
Yeah.